All right, good day everyone. This is our first video for our first week of our second unit in Principles of Persuasion. We just wrapped up the first unit, first 3 weeks of the semester. We had our quiz. Those grades are still in the works because I have to manually go through the written stuff. But now, this week, we're moving on to our second unit. And as mentioned in the syllabus and in the introduction video, now that we've kind of gotten through the opening kind of discussion of basic foundational, kind of general important things to know about persuasion, psychology, major concepts, major dynamics. Now we're going to start to move more into specific illustrations, examples of persuasion and how we encounter persuasion, and where it happens, and the different kind of characteristics of each of these different sort of like theaters through which persuasion takes place. And this first of these new kind of substantive units is dealing with persuasion in the most explicit and formal kind of sense that we can imagine. And so we're starting with arguments, deliberation, debate, argumentation. This is where persuasion is on the surface, right? I am trying to persuade you. I am engaging in an argument. I am offering my best series of reasons, my best rationale. I want you to be convinced. I want you to be persuaded, and I'm perfectly happy that you know that I'm trying to do this, right? And more than likely, you are participating equally in this effort to resolve some question or achieve some clarity, or maybe we're just sort of chewing over something and seeing where it goes. But the point is persuasion in this first substantive unit is sort of known, understood. This is what's happening, right? As we proceed in this semester, we're going to find more examples where it starts to move kind of below the level of perception, below the level of awareness. It's coming at us in ways that we might not be as conscious of or as hip to or whatever, right? But we want to start kind of broad, obvious, explicit, formal, official kind of thing. And I feel like a good place to start there is, if we're going to be talking about arguments, this isn't a class in argumentation or logic. I mean, that kind of stuff can get really technical and really dry and really almost like mathematical. And the nice thing about Stephen Toulmin, and we're not going to really talk much about Perelman, but around the same time, Kai and Perelman was up to much of the same ideas in terms of, you know, how does this thing rhetoric work, how does persuasion work, and what is its relationship to argumentation. And so I can just quickly say, up until the time of Toulmin, we're talking mid-20th century at this point, guy was writing forever, and I think he only died just fairly recently, so he was active until quite recent. But this book that this essay is referring to came out in 1958. So, you know, we're going back a bit. But it was an interesting intervention because up until that point, if you were thinking about argumentation, you were thinking about kind of like rules that needed to be followed, truths that existed, and it had really little to do with audiences and what audiences are willing to accept or what actually works with audiences. It's more about like, here are the right ideas and here are the right way of expressing these ideas, kind of top down, and audiences just sort of accept them or don't accept them. But the more we get interested in the actual processes and actual dynamics of persuasion, the more we have to be thinking about audiences, right? And so it makes sense that the focused study of persuasion in the 20th century, going back to the 30s, as was mentioned early on, somewhat overlaps and coincides with this work by Toulmin and others. Toulmin came from philosophy, as did Perelman. These are folks who are interested in other kinds of questions and find themselves coming into rhetoric and persuasion kind of from the side, right? But there is much of the same kind of activity, which is, let's think about what's actually working here when we're trying to persuade people. Not what should work, not what the logicians and the people writing up the diagrams tell us is right or valid, right? But what actually works in terms of real live audiences, real people, real tendencies, and so on. So Toulmin is really important and useful in this sense because he pushes the study of argumentation in a much more rhetorical direction, by which I mean much more audience-centric kind of direction, to be thinking about what actually works. So that's an important first point, is the kind of the practicalities, the pragmatics of arguing and persuading. So we're thinking about argumentation, which when you normally think about argumentation, it's like technical, right? It's like propositions and claims and evidence, and is it good enough evidence, and da-da-da-da-da. But we're also thinking about persuasion as a process of trying to get an audience to accept what you're offering so that you can move them here or here, right? So that's an important point. And then there was another point. Second important point. Oh yeah, the continuing importance and presence and relevance of Aristotle. There's lots of stuff in here that is basically like a direct throwback to the original theorist of the practicalities of persuasion, Aristotle. And we'll see that as we go. So as always, here are my notes corresponding with the reading. I'm not going to get us too bogged down in the nitty-gritty here. I'm going to just try to focus, keep it like a foot deep here. This thing goes a little deeper than we want to go in terms of this classification system. There's just a couple of key ideas that I really want us to get good on, and then we're okay with the rest of it. But I'll kind of let that be known as we go here. Just working through the numbers here. Thinking about persuasion through the medium of argumentation takes us to the work of Toulmin, who developed the notion that arguments are audience-based processes and not things. An argument as a thing is like sitting down and diagramming it, right? It's like, if this, then this, conclusion. And the point of that exercise is to come up with valid kind of outcomes based on sort of algorithmic. Based on certain inputs, certain outcomes should be guaranteed. And it's all very nice and well and good, but the problem is like we're not actually dealing with real situations, we're not actually dealing with real people, real audiences, real efforts to actually persuade, right? So Toulmin takes us in the direction of thinking about audiences, situations, and what actually works. Number 2, argument is a movement from accepted data through a warrant to a claim. Those are the three most important parts of this model. Normally, if you encounter Toulmin, undergrads tend to like shiver because they oftentimes will have this Toulmin model kind of like crammed down their throats. I don't want us to get that kind of, I noticed the title says Toulmin on argument, Toulmin. I don't want us to get bogged down in the kind of the technical apparatus here. I remember learning this stuff in grad school and teaching it to undergrads in grad school, and there's always this huge amount of stress about getting the diagrams right and all the different parts and the classification system and motivational and substantive and which one's which. I want to kind of try to simplify things and just appreciate the kind of dynamism in this model, but also noting a few key points along the way. But this business of data, claim, warrant, that's really important. When I talk to students about writing papers, writing analyses, right? Every time you write a paper, for my classes at least, but I think probably for most classes, you're making arguments for the most part. And so the point that I try to get across to students is, what's involved here, right? So you're doing all three of these things. You're dealing with data, you're making claims, and you're offering warrants, or just what I call explanations, right? So you guys are working on a paper's, I'm sorry, that's my other class. You'll be working on a paper at some point, but let's just assume you're analyzing a text of some kind, and you want to make a claim about that text, right? That new movie was garbage. Oh, really? How come it was garbage? Well, first of all, claim, it was too long. There's a claim. Okay. Maybe you don't like really long movies. Maybe it's a 3.5 hour long movie. So what's the evidence for that claim? Well, I guess the actual time would be the evidence, or the data. Data and evidence are, basically the same. The warrant is what is implicit in the relationship between the claim and the data, right? And so the warrant would say something like, humans we are accustomed to watching movies around 2 minutes or 2 hours, and anything beyond that is overly taxing. So I'm not exactly sure where you would classify that. It might be more of a pathos, motivational type argument. There could be some kind of a classification type argument there as well. The point is you have these parts that they're in play oftentimes when we are arguing, when we are making arguments, when we are reasoning or analyzing our way through something. We were trying to establish something, trying to establish an idea. How do you do that? Well, you offer your claim, which is your point, which is your conclusion, which is the thing you're trying to kind of get across. The data is the evidence for that claim, whatever it might be, whatever you have available. Don't forget, Aristotle's definition of rhetoric and persuasion is the ability to sorry, I got to get rid of a pop-up here. The ability to observe the available persuasives in a given case, right? So the artistry of your persuasive efforts comes from your ability to discern what would work best in any given case. Statistics, stories, historical cases, analogies, definitions, cause-effect relationships, like things, and on and on and on, right? So you're drawing on whatever you think would work best in order to make this argument work. The claim, data, warrant triad, warrant's always in the middle, right? And so the claim is the thing you're pushing out there, the data is what you're bringing to back it up, and the warrant is kind of what holds everything together in terms of the assumptions and the inferences that are being made, usually without being stated, but they're in there, right? That whole process is inferential, and if you watched hopefully you watched the Aristotle stuff, the videos, and got a good sense of what Aristotle was talking about with enthymemes, because we're really basically talking about enthymemes here with warrants, is that these are inferences that people are making. When I'm trying to convince you of something, when I'm trying to persuade you of something, I'm making inferences about you, assumptions, guesses, hypotheses. I'm trying my very best to kind of sense what it is you might accept, who you are, where you're coming from, what you may believe, what you may not believe, where you're at, right? I'm making all these little guesses and I'm trying to offer that up. Warrants explain the nature of those guesses, essentially, right? And so the warrant is really important here, although it's often not explicitly stated. It's because it's inferred, and that's that whole enthymematic process, is the stuff that I'm not saying is not needing to be said because it's so ingrained within us. You know what I mean? Like, it's just sort of, that's what you're tapping into. And that is such a key part of how it is that we persuade people. I say it over and over again. You cannot persuade people if they're not on your side, if you haven't established some kind of a connection. And that ability to establish connections is oftentimes my ability to understand who you are, where you're coming from, what you might actually agree with or disagree with. And to the extent that I'm able to kind of get that stuff right, I'm getting you on my side, and now I'm able to kind of appeal to you and move you in a different direction. So hopefully the data claim warrant arrangement makes some sense there, because it's really at the core of this argument model that Toulmin, they're saying Toulmin is offering here. By the way, I'm pretty sure Toulmin himself didn't actually create this model. I think the model comes from Brockriede and Ehninger. Brockriede and Ehninger were major argumentation, persuasion theorists, from a couple of generations ago. And so they were looking at the work of Toulmin, again, coming outside of rhetoric, coming from philosophy, and saying, hey, look, this is really important. We should be thinking about this in terms of how we think about arguments and persuasion. So they're kind of like commenting and interpreting and offering a more robust account of what we find in Toulmin. That's why we're reading them instead of Toulmin. I've taught Toulmin before, but his stuff's, it's more meandering, and this is a little tighter and tidier. So it's useful, but it's also a little bit more technical than we need. All right, so let's see here. Number 4, backing, rebuttal, and qualifier are important, but only secondarily. We're not going to stress too much about backing and rebuttal. That's basically just like anticipating opposition from an audience. If an audience disagrees with your initial data claim warrant kind of setup, then you might require backing, further backing, which is basically the new, let's see, I used to have this perfect. It's new data for the evidence, or the new data, new evidence for the warrant itself. But we're not going to stress too much about backing. We're not going to stress about rebuttal, except to note that arguments often do have rebuttals or resistance. And for me, those three secondary parts of this model, it's the it's the qualifier. There's too many letters floating around in my head here. It's the qualifier that really matters, because that is registering the degree of certainty or the degree of confidence that one has when making a claim, right? I'm personally not often persuaded by people who use all claims, or none claims, and just always kind of operate between the 0 and the 100. Just it's either that binaristic thing. It's like, you must accept this because it's 100% true, right? The world of Aristotle and the world of persuasion is the world of the probable, the more and the less. And I gave a bunch of examples about this kind of stuff in the enthymeme video and the Aristotle video. But everything for Aristotle is about probabilities. It's really, really difficult to say at any given moment how likely an audience will be to accept certain claims, certain assumptions, whatever. Think about your own self. You wake up in the morning. You might be more inclined towards certain things. You might be less inclined to certain things. You might be more staunchly pro-gun today than you are tomorrow. Your views can change day by day by day. We don't like to think they do, but they do, right? And so anytime someone's trying to reason with us, they're dealing with sort of fluctuating dynamics. And that's why we're dealing with the realm of the probable here, is because it's really, really, really difficult to know in advance. I still remember teaching public speaking as a graduate student, and the first day of class, I had a new, fresh class of undergraduates. I was going through the syllabus and talking about the assignments and the grading, and I had one real clever guy put up his hand and said, "This doesn't seem very, what do you say, like mathematical or quantitative or very clear, like how it is we're going to be grading on these things." And I was like, thanks for making my point for me. This isn't really the realm of the all or nothing here. It's not like they're persuaded, they're not persuaded. There's all kinds of in-between stuff here. So the realm of the probable is super important, and the qualifier is what registers that. Every time I make an assertion of some kind or other, I usually try to modulate that claim based on my own degree of confidence in its being correct, right? So I have some examples. We're not likely to find the missing document. It's almost certainly the case that Karen ate the last brownie. Why would you say almost certainly? Well, the warrant there might be historical, because of historical example, because of patterns, because cause and effect relationships. We put out brownies, there's one left, Karen comes in and takes it, right? So there's different ways of kind of authorizing that assumption, but nevertheless, there it is. And it's the degree. I would be very surprised if Ari showed up on time. So these are all ways of measuring or registering the degree of confidence in the claim you're making. I think qualifiers are really important. Sorry, I didn't get much sleep last night. I was traveling all weekend. And I'm moving quick here. I got to get going with things. But I'm trying my best to get a concise... What are we doing here? 18 minutes. Yes, we'll be fine. So it's about this movement, and the warrant is helping us to understand the dynamics, and also helping us understand what an audience may or may not actually accept. And the qualifier is meant to register that degree of confidence in that whole process. I am definitely certain. It's definitely going to happen. It's unlikely to happen. The degrees, right? That's important. Now, number 5 here, Toulmin's model specifically provides for warrant establishing arguments. This is important mostly in the way that Toulmin was rejecting kind of the discipline of argumentation and logic at the time, in the middle part of the last century, right? Which is a warrant given arguments, which is like, based on what we know about the cause and effect relationships between parents and children, we know that parents are always right and children are always wrong. That's established warrant. Do not question it. Well, what if you're dealing with a specific audience and they don't actually agree with that, or they have completely different experiences? Toulmin saw that argument would not work with actual audiences who don't agree with the warrant. And so the point is to establish the warrant with and through the audience, right? So in order to get this warrant established, the warrant of prior example, right? Karen always takes the last brownie. So in order to establish that warrant through the audience, they have to actually accept it based on the examples that you're giving. The last 7 times that we had brownie, there was always one on the plate, and Karen had no problem coming by and just scooping it up for herself. So it was probably Karen who took that last brownie. You see what we're doing here? So it's all about the more and the less, but within that range, you can still make pretty good arguments, and you can still work with audiences in ways that you're trying to grasp with their degree of likelihood in terms of accepting what you're saying, what you're offering. They work through like 7 virtues of the Toulmin model, and some of that stuff gets a little bit more dense than we need, but numbers 5, 6, and 7 are pretty good there. So word establishing arguments. Number 6, yes, Toulmin's model stresses the inferential and relational nature of argument. Again, that's Aristotle. Inferential. I'm always making inferences about what you are likely, hopefully going to accept, and I'm generating my appeals and my proofs based on that. But there's no guarantees, and that's where the rebuttal kicks in. What if you say, no, that's not right? What about Todd? Todd's always going on about how much he loves brownies, so it could easily have been Todd. Now I go to the backing. Well, I have camera. I have a camera up in the corner there. Now it's like slam dunk, right? I have evidence. So inferential and relational, again, is that Aristotelian, probabilistic, audience-based component of how it is that we argue when we argue. Number 8, and yeah, number 7 is the probable. We talked about that. Number 8 is important. The distinctions between the artistic and inartistic proofs. This goes directly back to Aristotle. Inartistic proofs are not super important for our purposes. They're things that we have no control over that are just kind of forceful in and of themselves, like contracts or oaths. Artistic proofs are things that we have control over. And for Aristotle, there's 3 of them. Do you remember what they are? They're ethos, logos, and pathos. We have control over ethos in terms of how we come across. Maybe we don't have absolute control over it. Maybe if we are horrible people, we're never going to convince an audience that we are actually good people. And it was, in fact, Quintilian who said, rhetoric is the good man skilled in speaking. The good man, right? And if you're not good, can you be skilled in speaking? His assumption was, no, you actually have to be a good person in order to impress audiences, because they can smell it, kind of thing, you know? So ethos is your character. Logos, as they talk about, has to do with relations among phenomenon in the world, right? And so cause and effect, generalization, induction, deduction, all the kind of ways that we understand reality and put it together. That's logos or substantive. And then, of course, pathos or motivational. That has to do with drives, values, passions, things we care about inside, right? All of these things are persuasive. And the artistic part is that we have some, what do they say at the bottom here? Inventional, where is it? Inventive powers of the arguer, right? So the arguer has inventive powers. Now think about Aristotle again here. How it is that we're trying to appeal to audiences is the artistic process of coming up with our available persuasives. What's going to work with these people today, right now, right here, given this question, given what I know about everything that's going on contextually, situationally, with these people in front of me here, right? Well, I'm going to draw on all kinds of different resources of motivation, authority, and substance, and we're going to kind of bring to bear what we can to establish warrants as the goal of persuasion. Okay. So that's number 10 there. Substantive is logos, authoritative is ethos, and motivational is pathos. Once you get all that lined up, you realize that Toulmin was just kind of rehashing Aristotle and bringing it into a kind of more contemporary context and trying to kind of, I don't know, tighten up some ideas there in terms of how the process works. But the process is basically the same as what we saw in Aristotle. Now, number 11 there, they go through a couple of pages of examples of substantive warrants. But I don't know that we need to get too bogged down in that, right? But like an analogy can be a warrant. And so war is hell, or war is a dogfight, or something like this. Making an argument about whether we shouldn't go to war because war is, I don't know, it's hell on earth, right? You're making an analogy, a substantive kind of an analogy, and you're also weaving in some motivational stuff there, right? So your claim is war is hell on earth. Your evidence is pictures of battle scenes and children screaming for their parents and, on and on. And so your warrant there is a substantive one based on kind of an analogy to some of the worst things that we can imagine, right? Classification is this thing goes in this place. What else? Or definition, right? Classification, definition. We got signs. We got parallel cases, analogies, classifications. These are all substantive or kind of logos-driven types of arguments that we make. Authoritative relies on the authority of a source that we're invoking, right? So according to the Bible, according to this expert, according to whatever the authority is, you're using that as your proof. Again, for Aristotle, the three modes of appeal are pistes. They're proofs. My character is a proof. If you believe me to be sincere, if you believe me to be good-natured, well-intentioned, kind-hearted, genuine, authoritative, expert, credible, and so on, you are more likely to believe what I'm saying than someone that you perceive to be otherwise, right? So your character becomes a proof. Itself is persuasive, right? So authoritative sources of argument are proofs. Again, not guaranteed. You always got to kind of establish. You're trying to establish these warrants through the audience, what they're likely to accept. But these are good ways of doing that. And then pathos or motivational. These are, again, things that we care about, things that, rely on drives, values, desires, priorities, right? So, we care about children. We care about innocent, right? We can use those sentiments, those values, as grounds for making certain kinds of claims. And that's about it. That's really all I want to cover. That's almost 30 minutes right there. Like I said, the essay itself goes deeper, gets more technical, but I really want to just focus on the probabilistic nature of arguments as Toulmin describes them. They're inferential. They're drawing on audience assumptions, and they're attempting to establish warrants through audiences in terms of what audiences may or may not actually accept. That is the whole truth of an argument. Ultimately, the proof's in the pudding, and the pudding is the audience and whether or not they accept something, right? And so you can be talking over the heads of your audience all day saying what's right and what should be and da-da-da-da-da, but if they're not listening and they don't care, then it all kind of amounts to nothing, right? And so Toulmin's getting back to Aristotle and back to a place of thinking about persuasion and rhetoric and argument as being audience-driven, as being about kind of informal assumptions that we're making constantly about where we are together in terms of what I'm reading from you and what I'm trying to get across and how you're responding and what I'm bringing to bear. And that process is grounded in these kind of three channels: the substantive, the motivational, and the authoritative. And the point is that I'm offering claims and evidence, but those things are grounded in these warrants that take these kinds of forms. But the warrants are always leaning toward audiences and what audiences may or may not accept. And that's a probabilistic process. So it's a dynamic, it's an ongoing, fluid, kind of open thing. So arguments, in this sense, look more like a kind of rough and tumble process of just persuasion more generally, which is like doing whatever I can. What's interesting here is that Toulmin is taking the field of argumentation, which is a very stodgy, technical, dry, formal kind of field, at least it was. Logic, reasoning, all the Venn diagrams and all the chains and all the if-then kind of stuff. He's saying all that stuff is well and good. However, what really matters in terms of thinking about what works is audiences, warrants, and what they will actually accept. All right? So that's that reading. There's one more for this week that I'll move to next. But hopefully that makes some sense. And as always, if you have questions, do reach out. See ya.